The U.S. economy is still suffering the effects of the Great Recession, but what few experts realize is that the recession and the current anemic recovery are caused in part by the fact that over the last decade, the U.S. has been losing the race for global innovation advantage. Other countries are simply out-competing us. And a key reason for that is that these other nations, whether it's India and China or Europe or South America, have coherent national innovation and competitiveness strategies. Even Albania's got one, but not the United States. So where's Uncle Sam? He's mostly worried about the budget deficit, not boosting U.S. competitiveness. So what's really holding us back? Why haven't we put in place a national innovation and competitiveness strategy that focuses on both a better tax and regulatory climate for making companies want to do innovation and manufacturing here in the United States, but also greater public investments on things like research, education, and infrastructure? Yeah, to be sure, our hyper-partisan politics get in the way, but fundamentally what's holding us back is a failure of the mind. In this case, it's the thinking among leading economists, journalists, pundits, and policymakers that's all too often flawed, and frankly, all too often just simply illogical. What we do in this ITIF report is lay out 9 key logic step failures. If you want to get from where we are today to a national innovation and competitive strategy, you've got to get through all of these 9 logic steps. Let's start with the first 5 that relate to whether we should even act. Number 1, you've got to admit that there's a problem. Just like on Alcoholics Anonymous, the first step to overcoming alcoholism is to admit that one's an alcoholic. The first step to reversing America's slide in the great race for global innovation advantage is to admit that we're not doing very well. We're losing the race. But unfortunately, too many in Washington argue that all is well, even in the face of disturbing evidence to the contrary. Indeed, the consensus view among many U.S. elites is that America's been number 1, we are number 1, and will just continue to be number 1. The second is to recognize that our trade deficit, which is chronic and massive, is a big problem. Over the last decade, the U.S. has accumulated an astounding $5.5 trillion trade deficit. And yet, when you listen to most economists, they'll tell you that the trade deficit is simply an accounting function. We don't save enough, therefore, by definition, we have to borrow from overseas, which by definition means we recover we have a trade deficit. Even the Council on Competitiveness, who you'd think would be fighting for U.S. competitiveness, argues that the trade deficit stems from, quote, global financial imbalances rather than the ability of American companies or workers to compete in global marketplaces. If you don't think that's the problem, then you're not going to do anything about it. Number 3, it's not just that we're not doing well. You have to understand and recognize and agree that we're actually in the race, that we're actually in competition. Countries put in place innovation and competitiveness policies in order to compete with other nations. But remarkably, a large share of U.S. elites don't even believe that we're in the race. Paul Krugman, the well-known economist, reflects this Washington consensus when he writes, quote, the notion that nations compete is incorrect. Countries are not in any important degree in competition with one another. Well, if we're not in competition, we can not even bother to train for the race. Fourth, we have to recognize that if we want to have a national innovation and competitiveness strategy, we're doing it in part because we want to get different and better and higher paid jobs and industries in the U.S. But a lot of elites, again, will say, you know what, it doesn't really matter what kind of industries we have, what kind of technologies, what kind of jobs. Bush 1 economic advisor Michael Boskin memorably quipped, potato chips, computer chips, what's the difference? Well, some even go so far as to say manufacturing versus retail, what's the difference? This car manufacturing, car rental, what's the difference view. Columbia University's Jagdish Bhagwati goes so far as to say that anybody who thinks manufacturing is important is suffering from a, quote, manufacturing fetish. So it's one thing to acknowledge that we've got a problem, that we're in competition, and that we've got to do something. It's quite another to argue that a proactive government strategy is needed. In fact, there are many who admit there's a problem. They see that we're in crisis, and yet for them the solution is for government to just get out of the way. Less government is going to be the solution. That'll be the thing that spurs Yankee ingenuity and lets the magic of the market do the trick. Gary Shapiro, the head of the Consumer Electronics Association, writes this in his new book, The Comeback, where he argues if we just reduce the regulatory burden and the tax burden, we'll be good to go. But obviously that's not enough. We've got to do a lot more than that. So even if you face the realization that we face a competitiveness challenge, that we need a proactive federal policy, the next question is, well, what kind of policy? And here there are 4 key logic failures that get in the way of creating and supporting a comprehensive policy. The first one is the view that says that all the government needs to do is enable, quote, more capital accumulation. And what economists mean by capital accumulation is this notion that if we just can get more money into the economy, more savings, that magically will drive investment. And that's all we have to do to create growth is just get more capital accumulation. For conservatives, that means cutting taxes on the rich. Supply-side economist Larry Kudlow states, tax cut incentives will promote capital formation. For moderates, it means boosting public and private savings, particularly reducing the budget deficit. Peter Orszag, the former Obama administration head of OMB, states, the fundamental belief of higher national savings achieved by preserving a substantial portion of the projected budget surplus is that it will expand economic output in the future. When that's the conviction held by policymakers that all we've got to do is figure out a way to get more capital in there, then it's pretty easy to argue that we should cut investments in research, infrastructure, and skills as a way to drive competitiveness and growth. The 7th big problem is the view that's much more insidious and on the surface looks like it's supportive, and that's the view that new firms and new technologies are enough. The belief that the U.S. can thrive just through new firms being created and new products entering the marketplace, more Facebooks, more Googles, more Twitters. As such, when you believe that then the focus is really on a whole set of policies around spurring firm startups and commercialization of new technologies from universities. Don't get me wrong, those policies are critical, but focusing on the new without renewal is going to fall way short. We have to focus not just on creating new firms and new technologies. We've got to focus on extending the lives of existing firms and existing technologies. But for some creationists, any concern about slowing the loss of U.S. jobs is seen as a waste of time or somehow downright protectionist. In a recent Washington Post editorial, Zachary Karabell argues that China steals so much intellectual property and engages in so much forced technology transfer, we should just stop. Don't even bother. It's a waste of time to even fight it. Let's just get on the path of creating more new firms and more new technology faster than the Chinese can steal it. So even among those who now will recognize that there's a role for government to act all around the innovation cycle and in many industries, many believe that role should be limited to simply supporting innovation inputs. In other words, provide the things that firms can just use on their own. Good educated workforce, a better regulatory system, good and better funding for basic research. For them, the problem is not within enterprises. It's just that enterprises lack these inputs. Give them the inputs and everything will be fine. The widely praised report, Rising Above the Gathering Storm, it was a report that largely reflected this view on innovation inputs, and that's why it focused so much on government increases in science funding and STEM education. But effective innovation policy has got to go beyond that. It's got to go inside the, quote, black box of the firm to help firms and key industries thrive. The last flawed concept or the logic problem that we have is this notion that many liberals have that the problem is about big corporations. Many on the left of the aisle will recognize there's a problem. They even see government as having an important role. But boy, those policies better not help big companies, those multinational businesses, the profit-hungry, selfish, uncaring Benedict Arnold companies that put the interests of shareholders ahead of workers. For them, there's no need to make the tax code more competitive. There's no need to protect companies from having their intellectual property stolen. There's no need to make sure that our regulatory system isn't putting up unnecessary barriers and burdens to U.S. companies. For them, the problem is U.S. companies. That's not the solution. So here we are, getting from here to there, with there being support for the development and implementation of a comprehensive national innovation and competitiveness policy requires a series of logic steps. And as you can see, any misstep along the way is enough to derail us from getting to where we've got to go. But if one accepts each of these steps, then the only logical conclusion is that to maximize U.S. economic welfare, to create new and good jobs, to get the U.S. economy back on the growth track, is that we need a national innovation and competitiveness strategy.